Language expressed during this episode may be deemed offensive. Viewer discretion is advised. Hello, and welcome to Season 1 of Through Black Eyes Unfiltered. Today we are going to be introducing the host and experts of this podcast, and I am sitting here with them right now, Dr. Raymond Dunn Sr. and Dr. Marvin Dunn. Welcome.
Thank you.
So the first episode we're going to be talking about is an introduction. And we would like to introduce you guys, since this podcast is about you at the end of the day, right? And so we want to look into who the Dunn Brothers are and why did the Dunn Brothers decide to do a podcast called Unfiltered?
I'm going to defer to Raymond to answer that question.
Okay, who are the Dunn Brothers? Well, let's start first with why did we decide to do a podcast Unfiltered? We decided to do a podcast Unfiltered because the story needs to be told. There's history and there's his history. And we need to get history straight. And we need to talk about how things that have happened in the past are relevant to things that are happening now.
Got it.
And so we want to go back and share some of the things that's happened over Florida's history and, quite frankly, beyond Florida, and how those things might relate to what we're seeing in our communities today.
And why a lot of those things have been covered up. Black history, Florida black history in particular, is a violent history. It's a difficult history to confront. And for that reason, a lot of the things have been whitewashed, covered over, reinterpreted. And I guess our view is that these stories need to be told through black eyes. Because, not to make any distinction that makes anyone uncomfortable, white historians have their own agenda sometimes for not being particularly straightforward about some of the things that have happened. And since Florida has one of the most violent histories of anti-black activities, we felt we needed to tell those stories. And for that reason, we have come together to put some of those stories together to share them with this audience.
And not only are we going to share a few of those stories, Marvin has gone further than that. Marvin has written a book called The Beast in Us.
The Beast in Florida.
The Beast in Florida. It talks about some of the things that even I didn't know. I thought I knew Florida's history pretty darn well about the lynchings and all of this. And he's documented just how violent Florida's history has been.
I went to just about every place in Florida where there has been a major lynching. In fact, I had at one point decide to only go to those places where there had been multiple lynchings because there had been so many in Florida.
Okay.
So from Rosewood to Ocoee to even Homestead, Florida, to look at these instances and to try to make them public.
Now, who are the Dunn Brothers?
Yes.
Let's go back to
Let's
that.
go back to that. So, who are the Dunn Brothers?
Okay, the Dunn Brothers. There are 6 Dunn Brothers.
6.
My oldest brother is James Dunn, and we could talk a little bit about him, but let me just go down the line so that we can get an order of things here. James is the oldest brother. Marvin is second.
Okay.
Our brother Bill, who recently passed away 2 years ago, was third. I'm the 4th brother, and my youngest brother is Levon.
Okay.
Now, my mom and dad adopted another brother. At what Thomas, we called him Bootsy, when he was about 15 years old.
Okay.
And he has now passed on. But those are the brothers who grew up together. And in these podcasts, we will share with you some of our history, because we grew up during a time that was very different from right now. And we grew up under the leadership of some parents who we're very proud of that shared with us some important things that we've never forgotten. One of those things was education. And although my dad stopped school when 8th grade, was it?
I don't think he got that far.
6th grade, I think.
He said one day he got mad.
I know what happened. Tell him.
And he hit the teacher and never went back.
Oh,
And
my
he walked
goodness.
out.
Walked out.
Dad got mad at the teacher.
And never went back.
I think it was slapped.
My goodness.
But our father was a well-read man. He kept himself informed. He also demonstrated to us, as did my mother, the importance of voting. I don't think our parents missed an election during the entire course of their lives. So we got these messages as we were coming up. And we were a poor family. My dad picked oranges in Central Florida.
No, wait a minute. That was a step up, picking oranges. Come on now. What about potatoes?
Potatoes.
I mean,
We were a migrant family.
All right.
We went up on the migrant season each summer. Our parents would take us at the end of the school year in June. We would travel on US 1, that was known as state back in those days,
Right.
from Miami to Long Island, New York, where there was a very healthy white potato farming industry. And as little boys, the first time we went up was in 1949. We would go up and pick potatoes and add to the family income in that way. But I tell you this, we came back after school started. We would come back around October after the first, right before the first
just before the
frost.
first snow. Yeah.
But even though our parents could make more money by having us stay in the fields and pick potatoes, when school started,
We had to come home.
Had to come home.
Come home, get out of your school clothes, put on your potato picking clothes, and go to the field.
I can't help but interject this because hopefully in other podcasts we were talking about education.
Absolutely.
But along with being migrants and
Yes.
picking potatoes, each school year we started school in New York.
Okay.
And one of the things that was very noticeable is when we returned to Florida, we were ahead of everybody in our class.
And we were the only black students in these schools.
Yeah, we were the only
Long
black
Island.
students in the schools that we attended on Long Island, New York. But every year when we came back, what we were being introduced to in the school system in Florida, we had already had that. One of the reasons I would like to share that with you is because I received my master's degree from University of Miami Desegregation Center. University of Miami, it went through the Desegregation Center because they were doing a program on migrants. And Dr. Gordon Foster introduced me to that, and I received a fellowship at the University of Miami because, to some extent, I had some expertise that I was able to share with them in migrant education because I was a migrant. And at the time, I was teaching in South Dade and Paran, and South Dade is where the Migrant Trail begins. It starts in South Florida and moves from South Florida to the muck we call Pihokee.
Around Lake Okeechobee.
People go up and pick beans and all sorts of crops up there. And then it goes all the way up the east coast of the United States as the season progresses. And what typically happens is you have crew chiefs, and they operate big buses, and they pick all these people up who are migrants, and they transport them, and they're responsible for them and all that stuff. My dad didn't do that.
Okay.
My dad would not subject us to that.
Wow.
My dad wanted to take advantage of making the money, and he had 5 healthy boys that could help pick the crops, but my dad saw to it that, number one, my mother was not exposed to that kind of life. You can imagine what the language was like on those buses. You can imagine some of the things. My dad wouldn't tolerate that. So he drove us there. So we
And
were
there were no
not,
bathrooms. You couldn't use a bathroom in the way. So
On those buses?
There was
No,
just
no.
like school buses.
Okay.
Converted school buses. And you could not use bathrooms along the way because
Along the way.
blacks weren't allowed to use restrooms at service stations.
as a matter of fact, you couldn't stop at certain places during that time. My mom had to prepare food that would last us from the time we left Florida until we got to New York.
About 2 days.
About 2 days. And she would prepare a dish of chicken and rice, and we would pretty much eat that. She called it purlo, and we would pretty much eat that for 2 days, because you could not stop very many places and get food nor use the restroom.
Yeah, use the restroom in the woods.
Yeah, during that
In
time.
the woods, use the restroom.
So anyway, that's what we mean by we started out as migrants, and we lived in a migrant camp. We lived in several migrant camps, as a matter of fact.
Poor housing, very, very poor housing.
Yeah.
Basically converted barns and sheds.
Yeah, the migrant camp housing really consisted of where they used to keep the animals.
Or the equipment.
Or the equipment. They just converted the stables and the tractor barn into housing for people like us.
It's not that much better now in some places. Can I tell my story now?
Yes,
okay.
tell your story, and then we'll move on into...
We had to go to these all-white schools, and I think I must have been maybe in the 3rd or 4th grade when this happened. And frankly, I was shy. I was not as smart as these white kids were. I felt intimidated in these classrooms. And this very nice white teacher, young teacher, tried to help me feel more comfortable. So one day during music, she said, Marvin, why don't you sing a gospel song for us? I said, but I don't sing. She said, sure you do. How about Swing Low, Sweet Chariot? I was so embarrassed, I just sort of sank into my chair, and she moved on to somebody else. But it's one of those things from my past that I remember made me feel less adequate than the white kids who were in that classroom at that moment. Although I did appreciate what she was trying to do, the result of it was a lifelong memory of being uncomfortable in my own skin.
But in terms of who are the Dunn brothers, we just talked a lot about Pop. We call our dad Pop. Let's talk for a minute about Mom.
Okay.
Because although Dad dropped out of school in 6th grade, my mom graduated high school and was actually on her way to college when my dad convinced her to marry him, and he would later send her to college. She never got there.
She never let him forget that he made the promise.
Right. She never let him forget it, but she never made it to college. But my mother saw to it that, and my dad, that all of their boys received an education. My mom served on every PTA, every band booster. You know, Mom was there.
Oh, wow.
Mom went to every teacher meeting. Everybody in the school system knew our
That's
mother.
amazing.
And there was no debating. If the teacher said Marvin did this or Raymond did this, there were no two sides to the story. Your behind got whipped when you got home.
Period.
And the word of the teacher was taken as fact.
And just to document testament of that, they named the street after my mother because of all of her civic work and all of her work in the schools.
And healthcare.
Yeah, and
Northgate Healthcare Center.
And anyway, my mom.
What's the name of the street?
The street is Corinne Dunn Way.
Okay, and where is it?
It's in Miami Gardens. It's in the Opelika area on 151st Street, intersecting 22nd Avenue, and 22nd Avenue all the way over to 27th Avenue, to the west and east over to the canal. There's a canal there where the street ends. But they named that street after her in honor of all of her civic work. They did a dedication, and they wrote a letter for her from the president's office, put it in the congressional record. I mean, she did all of that stuff, along with raising 5 boys and then adopting another.
No girls?
No, there were no girls. We had
No
to
girls.
grow up without a sister.
Oh, my.
So
Oh, my.
those are the Dunn brothers.
Got it. And so as we transition into the historical significance of Through Black Eyes Unfiltered, what are a few historical events that this podcast is going to enlighten us on?
Well, we're going to start with the Rosewood Massacre of 1923.
Okay.
a film was made about that, so it's a fairly well-known event, and that's why we chose to begin with the Roosevelt story. We're also going to tell the story of Willie James Howard, who was a 15-year-old black child growing up in North Florida, who was lynched because he wrote a love letter to a white girl. And the father got a hold of the letter and went to this boy's house with two men and had him lynched. And not very much at all was ever written or told about the Willie James Howard story. We're also going to deal with the civil rights movement. Ray was in college at Florida A&M University when these demonstrations in Tallahassee, which made a big impact on the history of Florida and civil rights, he participated in that. He was arrested in the process of demonstrating in Tallahassee. So we focused on the civil rights movement.
St. Augustine.
And St. Augustine as well, but Dr. King failed to make any great progress, and we'll tell why and what happened there. And we're going to do a segment on the Miami Riot of 1980, which we both lived through, and I wrote a book on that subject, and that was one of the most incredible experiences that I've ever lived through. So those are some of the things that we're going to talk about in the course of these podcasts.
And what's the significance of viewing them and having the conversation? What do you want the millennials and the
We want them to know what
share.
happened. We want to know. People move away from their history way too fast. And we want people to know that these things did happen. And as people...
And they're still happening
And
today.
they're still happening today. We want to be able to connect some of those events to current life, particularly for black people in this country.
And one of the things that I want to add to that, not only what happened, and show that they're still happening today, but Marvin is a certified community psychologist. He's a psychologist, a community psychologist. And I know he served on many boards. He couldn't even name the number of times he's been called on by the city of Miami to help resolve our community type issues. I would like to challenge him in some of these podcasts to share with our listeners, how can we fix some of these things? How can we stop some of these things from happening? Yes, it happened back in this year, it happened again in the 60s, it happened again. How do we stop it? As a community psychologist, what are your recommendations to the cities in this country, to the populations that are dealing with this? How do we stop it? So in one of our podcasts, we will address that.
Okay. You want to add to that?
Well, I think we've basically covered what our purposes are and sort of the scope of where we're going with these. But I am always impressed with how little people know. How people
Wait, did you say you're always impressed?
Yes.
With how little they know?
Yes.
Why is that?
I don't mean impressed in a positive way.
I understand. That's why I'm asking.
It impresses me that young folks don't know shit, basically. And they don't. I had a class once and I asked, these are college students, how many of you know who Arthur McDuffie was? Not a single hand went up.
Wow.
This was the man whose death caused the Migrant Riot of 1980 that led to 18 deaths and $100 million worth of damage in this community. They don't know who Arthur McDuffie was.
May I beat that one? Because this is just this week.
This week?
Knowing that we were going to film this week, I took one of his books to work with me.
And where do you work?
Broward College.
Okay.
And I took his book to two of my classes. And on the cover of the book is a picture that was taken in Miami. And on that cover is Malcolm X and
Yes.
Muhammad Ali and some other people. Now, these are college classes,
College.
college students today. I took that book, I held it up, I read all around my classroom asking students, can you identify anybody on this cover?
Oh my.
Out of two classes, I had 3 people
Whoa.
to identify Muhammad Ali, and one guy identified Malcolm X.
Oh
And that
my.
photograph was taken in Miami, in
Yes.
Liberty City.
Yeah.
So I had a question to ask of why is Through Black Eyes Unfiltered needed now? And I think you just answered the
Exactly.
question.
It's needed now because today's generation just do not know. They need to know. They need to learn from our history.
Well, there's another part of it too that may be not all that comfortable to say, but you know, I'm 77 years old.
Okay.
My brother's right behind me. Our generation is passing on. And we're not the only ones who know these stories. A lot of folks listening to us right now lived through the same things that we did. A lot of folks listening to this podcast went to segregated schools, had to go through the back doors of white folks' homes. Yeah. So this is a generation that will not be here forever, not be here much longer to share these stories. So I think it's important to get them told now. Not that we're planning to leave anytime soon.
But you know, it's interesting.
Recognize the reality.
It's interesting that you raised that point, because I was going to ask a question of you relating to that. I was going to ask you, Brian, who are today's leaders? Now, we go back during our day, and we know all of the leaders.
You mean other than Al Sharpton?
That's my point. Al Sharpton
is the only leader?
But who else is out? I mean, Jesse Jackson, bless his soul. You know,
current leaders, because they are older.
Yeah, no, that's the question. Who are the black leaders today? We are a dying generation. Who?
Cory Booker.
Okay.
Well, I think the black leaders of today are in individual communities.
Okay.
You look at what's happening with Black Lives Matter.
Okay.
Those leaders are not folks of the Malcolm X status
Right.
or ML King status. They're local leaders who are organizing people, white and black and brown, to protest the kinds of things that leaders who have had international stature have protested. You don't get a king, a Martin Luther King, except maybe once in 100 years. You don't get a Malcolm X except maybe once in a century.
Because they're needed for that time.
They're needed for that time, and they're men who really, and women, who really were of not particularly notable status until the moment made them historically relevant and historically important.
Is it possible the reason why the young people are asleep and don't know nothing today is because the requirements are not at the level they were back then?
Well, no, should they be? I don't think it's right to require college students to go to a chapel service 5 days a week. But they should be required to do more than they're doing now. Some sort of requirement that y'all sit down, goddammit, and listen to something that's important that you need to know.
Or study it.
Right.
Well, here's what I think about college students. Go back over our history and look at what group had the biggest impact on changing the direction of history.
70s?
And I think you will find, go back as far as you like, I think that you will find that college students played a major part. Look at Vietnam. Who started the protests? Who led
college
those
students.
college students? Look at the civil rights movement. Who were all over the campuses?
Yes.
College
And it's
students.
a little bit, and the climate's changing a little bit right now because now we have high school students who are getting involved and working to change climates as well.
Same thing in South Africa. There's high school students and junior high school students in South Africa who brought international attention to apartheid. Up until the time that they started shooting students in Soweto, killing kids, that the world took notice of what was going on in South Africa. So Ray's point is well taken.
That's why this podcast is important, because that's the generation that we need to reach. And I am so impressed with the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas students and the things that they're trying to get done in terms of...
Yeah, I thought about you during those times. I thought about our conversations on it.
See, college students, high school students, they've got to understand they are the wave of the future. They are the move. People like us, we're on our way out. Hopefully, like you said, not too soon, but we need the younger generation, and they've got to understand. You can't lead into the future if you don't know the history. You got to know where you're coming from.
Through black eyes.
Unfiltered.
Through black eyes, unfiltered. Do you think they're ready to accept this? Or do we care?
Well, I care. I think people of our generation do care. And are they ready to accept these
The
things?
listeners, not the listeners. Do you think the listeners care? Or the listeners who will be hearing, do you think they are ready to accept this type of podcast?
Well, who could have known about those students at Parkland, whether they were ready or not?
Okay.
Events define the people, young people in particular, rising up to the moment. I don't think youth today are any different than youth in past generations, going back as far as you wish. That's where the energy and the vitality is. The moment needs to bring them forth.
I have a saying that, a lot of things start in the home. So when I see things missing in the now, it makes me go back and think, okay, well, what did they get in their home? And going back to your parents and what they taught you guys as we begin to wrap up the introductory section of Through Black Eyes. They were leaders within themselves, it seems. And then they taught you guys to be leaders.
Well, today, I'm not quite sure about the numbers, but I think 7 out of 10 black children today are being raised by single mothers. There's no father in the home.
I didn't have a father, and I was just talking about this yesterday.
So if you look at the amount of, there's no other way to put abandonment, or at least the absence of strong father figures. I think these moms are not doing a great job on their own. There's a big gap there, and there is more of that among our African American families than you see anyplace else.
And we have to ask ourselves, is one of the reasons for that the governmental system of
Is it
providing
systematic?
What they provide funds for single moms if the father isn't in the house. How does that work?
Well, there are policies.
You have children, and you can get government assistance, but if the father is in the home, you can't get it.
If any man is in the home.
For the African American
But that
people.
works against black families.
He works against all families. That's part of the institutionalization of racism in ways that may be well intended, but end up having the opposite effect.
Opposite effect, okay.
I mean, we need fathers.
But I would also say that one of the reasons for the absence of black males, black fathers in these homes, go back to some of these stories we want to share, some of the history that we want to share, that will make it clear to the listener that there were things going on that disempowered black men historically to be strong fathers. I mean, suppose you were a dad in Overtown in the 1930s when the Klan came running through and riding through on horses, and you had to tell your wife, hide under the bed, and tell your children, hide under the bed. What kind of emasculation impact does that have on a man trying to raise his family? So we have a lot of things that we could look at other than governmental policies that didn't work as well as they should have. That might explain some of the kinds of family problems we see today among African American families in particular.
Wow, so I think the listeners and the viewers are in for a treat with you two.
Well, one could hope.
We certainly hope so.